So welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Colleen Ehrlich. I am the president-elect for the Colorado Association for the Gifted and Talented, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Terry Strout, who will be talking today around Keep Your Children Well, and insights from when we lost. And this is a very personal story for her, one that I'm just so grateful to her that she is willing to share on so many different levels with so many different audiences so that we can learn from her and her family's experiences. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Terry. If you do have any questions, we are going to ask that you hold them to the end, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat so that we can talk about those in just a little bit. So, great. Terry Strout.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. And I do want to thank CAGT because this is a very full circle moment for me. I had this idea very shortly after Patrick passed that I needed to do something to tell the story to make a difference. And Terry Bradley kind of didn't force me, but when I was coming up with excuses why I couldn't do it, she was like, yeah, that's not the excuse. You're going to have to face yourself on this one. And so I was able to tell the story at CAGT, I think 2013, and then reached out to Dr. Cross to engage in a full-on psychological autopsy. So at any rate, I will also say that CAGT has been my professional development for 20 years. My very first event as a parent was the NAGC parent conference, I think 20 years ago. And I met George Betts that day, and, life changed in all kinds of wonderful ways. So here's the handouts are on the Patrick Strout Foundation website, /presentation-handouts. I've been blogging for about 5 or 6 years, and that's patrickstaylorstrout.wordpress.com. And then the website is simply patrickstroutfoundation.org. And I will say on the website, I've been called upon to provide resources for gifted and talented, resources for suicide prevention, and resources for grief recovery. So there's a tab for each of those. And, I'm happy to answer questions. If people have other resources that they would add, please send them to me, and I'm happy to, I build that out so that it's kind of a place that people can go for trusted things in terms of resources. I will say the presentation, the first, until this year really, my presentation really went kind of grade level by grade level and told Patrick's story as a twice exceptional kid, talked about medications and teacher fits and learning fits and changing schools and all that stuff. And now that we have the psychological autopsy, a lot of that is documented there. And what's come out of it is a just deeper understanding, certainly for me, and I think even for Dr. Cross, of suicide ideation models and prevention models that work for gifted kids. And so the focus on this, it will really be kind of taking those models and looking at what happened to Patrick to kind of help us think about how we can do a better job of preventing this from happening to other families. The psychological autopsy was published in Roper Review in January. There's the link to that. If you don't want to pay $35 for it, there's a draft copy on the William and Mary site at that ScholarWorks link, or you can just Google the title of it, A Psychological Autopsy of an Intellectually Gifted Student with Attention Deficit Disorder. And you can find the PA there. And I refer to it as the study. So if I'm talking about the study, that's what I'm talking about. And I think this work is particularly important right now because I've several other sessions, we're all talking about how kids are even more isolated and there's even more calls to our suicide hotlines and our Safe to Tell here in Colorado. And so it's just important work. And I'm happy to share what I know about it. So shout out to the Doctors Cross. This is Tracy Cross, past president of NAGC. and his lovely wife, Jennifer, are the two main authors on the study. This has been Tracy's life work. He's done 4 of these psychological autopsies, and then was sat on the dissertation committee for a student at another university who did a 5th one on a girl. The 4 he's done have been on young men. I think he was interested in Patrick because he had an ADHD diagnosis, and there hadn't been a study of an ADHD or twice exceptional student at all, since there are only 5 in the world. And so I reached out to Tracy after I told the story at CAGT and shared with him. I had 20 pages of instant messaging chat that showed exactly how things went down. And I thought that would be of interest and would certainly do better with academics looking at it than sitting in a file cabinet. So we engaged, and it took them over 5 years. Dr. Cross says that his research team of 5 had about 1,000 hours, at least 1,000 hours in evaluation. And in the study, they call him Daniel. So one of the things that the Crosses did that really honors my heart is the first PA that Dr. Cross did 20 plus years ago, probably more like 30 years ago, was actually Reed Ball, the young man whose suicide was the kind of trigger point to create SANG, supporting the emotional needs of the gifted. And one of the things that Reed's mom said was, you have to use his name. I know that, institutional research says you can't use their name, but you have to use his name. And so Tracy asked me when I saw him in February after it published if I wanted him to use his name. And so it's written Daniel, but when he talks about it, he'll talk about Patrick. And I think there's real power in taking the academic and then, marrying it with what I know as the mom, the lived experience piece of it, to bring those two things together. And at some point when it's not so fresh, I'd love to really, kind of go toe to toe and debate some of the things, because it's all based on perspective. So they had the perspective of the people who they interviewed, but not the people who they didn't get interviews with. So anyway, big shout out. It's important work. So, and some of these slides I'm actually are based on, Tracy did a SANG in July that talked about suicide prevention, where he talked about some of these models. So in some cases you'll see I'm just using his slide with his face on it because they were so darn good. But you got to start with what is suicidal behavior. And so definitions are ideation, which is pretty common. This is, I heard in a session yesterday, people were talking about, kids just say, I wish I wasn't here or whatever, but they don't really act on it. And then, then you get into attempts, and then you get into completions, which are obviously successful attempts. The prevalence rate is increased. This is so concerning. Increased 35% from 1999 to 2018. And the research suggests there's an average of 3.7 attempts to completion. But I've seen numbers all over the place with that. So here's I just need to, this helps me ground and helps people kind of understand the family dynamics. Patrick was born June 25th, 1992. And he was, very much a wanted child. My conversation when I talk about school is, kind of kindergarten through high school. He was just an adorable little boy. Those blue eyes. He was so precocious. But one of the things I always say to teachers is that parents don't know that their kid's funky usually till they hit school, because we don't know what we don't know. Like it's all like he was just the kid that lived in our house. And so, we didn't notice attentional things. He was interesting with speech. So he wasn't like he didn't babble a lot or use like partial sentences, but when he was not quite 1.5, we were driving home from daycare at Christmas time. And I pulled into the driveway and he said, "No home, mommy, more lights, please." Like this complete sentence. So I think he was just waiting until he had the syntax or something. So he's just kind of an interesting kid. again, those intense blue eyes. From the very time this happened, I kept thinking about the over-excitabilities. And I think I might be in an intellectual over-excitability about over-excitabilities at this point as an adult, honest to God, because I really believe that understanding the OEs and using that as a filter when we look at the suicide prevention models and we look at the models, you have to think about how does a child who has a lot of these over-excitabilities, how does that influence how they interact with the model? And so I won't go into it. I think we all know sensual, psychomotor, emotional, imaginational, and intellectual. Patrick had all but psychomotor. He was the kind of ADHD kid who could look at you and be in Disney World in his brain, but he didn't get up and run around. But all the rest of them, super imaginational, super sensual. He was the kind of kid that had to have a particular kind of Hanes sock, couldn't have a tag in the back of his shirt. He just couldn't do it. So 4.5 years after Patrick, Brendan came along. My little Irish twins, my husband's Irish. And so we had our little Irish knuckleheads. They were just kind of classic brothers, shared a room. We had that classic push-pull of, olders and youngers. As soon as Brendan could do something, that would push Patrick to try to do the next thing. But Patrick was always my timid one. Brendan, passed out of the swim class on the first go. It took Patrick 3 or 4 times in guppies before he got to go to dolphins. So, and if you look at their CAGT scores, I've done that in other presentations, like they look like the same child, but the way they present in the world was very, very different. One introverted, one extroverted. And I would say Patrick was more emotional, more charged that way. And then 4.5 years later, we went to China and adopted Emily, and the boys came with us. And that was an amazing trip for Patrick because he was totally immersed in culture and loved his little baby sister from the get-go and was sort of the big brother for all the babies in the group. It was just a fabulous trip. And he just had an amazing relationship with her. She would jump up on him and koala hug, and he would just hold her. So I'm going to stop on this one since I didn't really go through school stuff. In the handout, you'll see there's a timeline from the PA that addresses all the medications and all that. But I'll pause here just to kind of summarize before we go forward. He was in public school for K through 5 in Jeffco. And then he was at McIntosh Academy, Littleton for 6, 7, and 8. And then his little cohort, there were 8 kids who graduated from McIntosh, and 6 of the 8 went to Littleton IB, which I knew would not be a good fit for him, but he had his little cohort. And sure enough, about this time of the year, one day we're driving home from Littleton and he said, "Mom, I looked into this IB thing and I don't think I really want to work that hard. Why would I work so hard to maybe save a year of college? I think college is going to be a blast." And I was like, I don't know. But I wouldn't move. I didn't want to move him because it was just, those transitions were really hard. And he had his little friend group. So he stayed at Littleton. He also had his very best friend was Evan. And they were in 1st and 2nd grade together and then never in school again. But our families kept in touch and they would not see each other for a month or 2. And then when they got back together, they never missed a beat. And that was a huge blessing for both of those boys. And then, so he was totally enthralled with history in general, the Civil War in particular, and saw himself as a rebel. And he was conscripted into the Confederate Army by Robert E. Lee at a reenactment in Delaware, and it was like the best day of his life. That hangs on my wall as his life accomplishment because he didn't really finish high school. So anyway, and then the bottom picture there is him with my cousin and the guns, and he developed a strong interest in guns about this time. This was, I think, going into 7th grade. And he was always super safe. My cousin Buddy taught them that day how to lock them up, how to be careful. And that picture haunts me because we'd never had guns in our house until later on. So there's that timeline. Again, it's in your handout. And on the bottom is all the medications across the timeline. So he had a really bad reaction to Adderall, and I think we landed on Concerta, and that worked. But about halfway through middle school, he felt like he didn't need it anymore. So now we get into the lived experience, and these are some quotes from Dr. Cross. So I think one of the most important things as a parent and as a teacher, just as a person interacting with other people who you might be concerned about, is to recognize that the person's experience is whatever's in their head. So it might not seem like it's a big deal to you, but if it's a big deal to them, it's a big deal. And you need to, not push that away or downplay it. It doesn't help anybody. And so I will say, he also said being gifted is being different. I remember trying to coach Patrick in high school at one point about advocating for himself and saying, it's a blessing. Your gift is a blessing. And he said, it's not a blessing, Mom, it's a curse. I don't want to be different, So this is the push and pull. I feel like when they get into high school, the standing out is really hard. And this is one of the challenges. If like he came from a very small gifted school, K-8 school with all gifted teachers, everybody there got it. And then you land in a public high school where nobody gets it, and you can be a fish out of water pretty fast. That was part of his experience. I think this is the most important graphic of the whole deck. And there you do see Dr. Cross in the corner. He talked about this, and I think this is sort of a 3D version of the suicide trajectory model. But I think this is more memorable. And I have to tell you, I've heard teenagers talk about this spiral, that feeling like they were in the spiral at least 20 times around the campfire at the Wheat Ridge High School GT retreats. Like when kids stand up and share what it is they're trying to, purge in their life, or what they're thankful for their friends about, they talk about this feeling. So you're walking on the plane of normal functioning, and something happens, you have a car crash, or you have a relationship problem or something, and you kind of start down that corkscrew. But we generally have the the wherewithal and the tools to turn around and head back up. And then when we get into psych-8 or hopelessness is when people sort of drop through the bottom. And those are the things we want to be listening for when we start to ask the questions about suicidal ideation. So this one's a real keeper. The other thing is it kind of just shows that, there's all these different labels of the different kinds of risk factors and protective factors. Basically, protective factors are pushing you back up the spiral, and risk factors are dropping you back down. So this is another, in terms of like, what can we do as parents and educators? If we know somebody's in that spiral, one of the things we can do is not, pile on, but girls don't do that, or boys don't do that, or you think you're smart, or you shouldn't do that, or you must do this, as we need to let them have their own lived experience and not kind of pile too much on. All right, so now we get into the risk factors, and basically 4 buckets here. You've got biological risk, psychological risk, cognitive risk, and environmental risk. And these are all factors that I believe we can do. We can't do much about gender or genetics, but there are a lot of things that we can, as parents and educators, do to help people face their depression and get assistance, help teach problem-solving skills, help with inflexible thinking. Presence of deadly weapon, that was an issue. In our house, we never had any guns, but when Patrick turned 18, he bought guns, because in Colorado, you can buy a long gun when you're 18. And that became the deadly weapon. So here's the classic suicide trajectory model. And this is why I think that the spiral is kind of better, because it's a little more nuanced. But the point is, you got to kind of get into that blue zone and start a conversation and a connection to keep them from dropping down. So, okay, so ready for high school. This is his Vote for Pedro shirt. He was young. He was a June birthday. So when he entered high school, definitely had the OEs, was coming from that kind of sheltered environment, had a few deep friendships, no girlfriends. There was only one girl in the middle school class. He'd taken himself off the ADD meds. Academically, he's very much a hands-on learner, visual spatial, and he was, good grades in a small school where they set the bar high. With Patrick, if you set the bar high, he'd meet it. If you set the bar low, he'd also meet it. So a small school that had high expectations was a really wonderful place for him, but the transition to high school was challenging. So this is where the red flags start on my slides. And I still we never had a depression diagnosis. And at this point, I don't know, was he just surly? I think a lot of 15-year-old boys kind of look like this, right? They don't want to hang out with you. They'd rather play their guitar. He was a wonderfully self-taught musician. He had studied violin in school and translated that to the guitar. So he spent a lot of time on the guitar. At this point, his grades were A's if he liked it. Like this year, he had an A in driver's ed and an A in pop rock music, but, was really struggling with integrated math, just the way they spiraled the content. And he had kind of decided he wasn't good at math. So this is where the OEs come in, the emotional piece. In his junior year, he started to date a girl around homecoming in the fall, and she broke up with him by text message to date his best friend at spring break. And he happened to be with his best friend, Evan, and his family up in the mountains. And he called and asked his dad to come get him. He was physically ill. He was so concerned about this breakup. His heart was just broken, and he just imploded. The rest of the school year, we were like trying to coax him to just finish it up and get the credit. And he just had no reason to get out of bed in the morning. We did try counseling at that point. I took him to a counselor that Evan had gone to when he had lost his grandmother, and this guy was, specialized in gifted kids. And Patrick went 3 or 4 times, and then just at one time wouldn't get out of the car. Just was like, it's a waste of my time. I just want to go home. And my mistake there was to not find another counselor. But, hindsight's 2020. So his senior year, we brought him back to Jeffco, and he had a really good senior year because the asynchrony, he was 17 as a senior his whole year, but his friends were mostly sophomores. So he was kind of the big guy on campus because he had a car and he could drive, and he made friends and, kind of found his niche. The other thing I always do is make a pitch for Warren Tech and Jeffco or any kind of experiential learning for our gifted kids. Some of our kids just really need hands-on. And I thought he'd go into game design, but it was full. And, being ever the advocate, I was like, I'll see what I can do, try to get you in. And he's like, no, I think automotive customization is going to be great. And he loved it because he was doing something with his hands all the time. And the teacher there embraced him too. He was a retired Marine, real clean cut. And Patrick was Army jacket, smoking a Marlboro. I thought this is never going to work, but they respected each other. And Mr. Bentz actually said Patrick helped him be a better teacher because he could see him starting to zone off, and he would, have to be more engaging in how he talked to the kids, let them work on cars while they talked things through. And then I always have to put the blue Chevelle in because that's the car he wanted. So his senior year, he started dating a younger girl. And, you've got a kid that's highly emotional and, has that intensity. and is introverted. Once somebody kind of gets in their heart, they have a lot of power. And so his senior year, he didn't graduate on time because he had imploded in his junior year and came back to Jeffco with lacking credits. But Evan graduated that year. And we went to Evan's graduation at Red Rocks, and he was wearing that black suit, and it was hot. You know how those Red Rocks graduations can be. And we had a great time. Evan had a nice little party, and on Monday, his counselor called, and that was at the time when they would still let them walk, even if they didn't have all their credits. And he said, Patrick didn't fill out the paperwork to graduate, to walk. It's on Saturday. And I said, well, I'll ask him. And so I said, do you want to do your graduation? And he literally said, one graduation in a lifetime is quite enough. He had no interest at all in going to his own graduation. So when he turned 18, we had a picnic on the deck, and his friends all came over. And this is like within a week, he went out and bought a long gun. So by the fall, the next year, he was gonna do the second year at Warren Tech for college credit, but didn't. The teacher changed and he couldn't sustain that. So then we were like, okay, we got to get a job. And that was really hard because he didn't really have the skills to go eyeball to eyeball and ask for, a job. He said he knew how to fill out the online application. He never told me this. He told his friend Shane. So things were a little rocky. And then in the fall, my grandmother passed away, and he said he would come home and be a pallbearer. And so we all flew to Delaware for the funeral. And almost as soon as he got there, he was like, I don't want to be here. I want to go back to Colorado. And one of the things in the models is actually, if there's been another loss in the family. So I don't know whether this was piling on or not, but I put a red flag on the slide. This was his last Christmas. And I kind of look at the posture. I don't, he wasn't standing in his own, but we didn't realize what was going on. So January, they break up, or they start to break up. And he starts taking classes with Evan at Red Rocks, and he was getting all A's, even in a speech class. I was really surprised. We get a very strange phone call on the landline late February, and it's the girl, and she says, we need to talk to you, but we never heard him. And long story short, there was no conversation. Eventually, she just hung up, and then he came in and swore he wasn't with her. My husband pulled him aside and said, is she pregnant? Tell us what can we do? Total denial. So at that point, he thought that she was pregnant. We didn't realize that. We didn't even ask again. We thought they had really broken up, but they were doing that back and forth that kids do. Our concern is about school and grades. And meanwhile, we have no idea that he's totally freaking out. So he skipped his midterms, and then that got worse. He had a day off from school, so he was just laying tile, and everything was doing kind of fine. And then that evening, he texted the girl, and I guess I knew he was talking to her again, but it had been back and forth, so that wasn't really an issue. And long story short, they got online and onto an instant message, and it very quickly went from, how am I going to get my iPod back? He had her iPod, to a suicide. And it's clear that he had talked about suicide to her before, but not to any of us. And so then she says, well, how are people going to know what you want me to have? So he, again, went online. He's in the basement. This is one of my things. If you're concerned, don't let them be in an isolated place, because we had no idea this was happening in our house. And he went online and wrote a will, and then came back to the chat, and he said, that's it. You're not even going to try to stop me. And she challenged him to kill himself. So she said, everybody I've ever told about it says you're not going to do it. And he said, like who? And then she named his friends by name. And then he said, well, I'm going to prove them wrong. And she said, yeah. And he's like, well, what if I actually do? And she says, I don't know. Like they were kind of playing a game about this. This is insanity, right? But she says, I don't know. And he says K, and she says, I don't believe you. And he typed the letter K and completed suicide. So here, I put this back in because what's the impact of actually being challenged to complete suicide in the middle instead of trying to fix it? She challenged him. That was not the thing to do. Not to be morbid, I just always put this in to say, as educators, try to be there for the family. It was so important for my other two kids that they saw their principals, they saw their teachers, that those people, when they saw them in the hall 2 months later, they knew. That was really important. And Evan and Brendan gave the eulogy. They're his 4 friends, and they're still all in our lives, which is just such a blessing. So we come back to these risk factors, and if it was a bingo card, we'd have bingo. Very sadly, right? Like it was all there. It was all there, and we didn't see it. So again, there's the timeline of events. I mentioned QPR because I think this is another way of looking at the models, right? So they talk about the paths of suicide. Again, same kind of thing: biological, psychological, environmental, and then that all causes are real. If it's between your ears, it's real. And hopelessness is the most common pathway. I didn't share that part of the chat, but in one part of the chat, she said, what's different about this time than before? And he said, before I had hope. So you hear that word hope or hopeless, run, do not walk for help. So this is out of the study, and this is a work out of Toronto, I think, where they've kind of identified the different kinds of factors, the contributing factors, predisposing, precipitating, and protective factors. And then what the crosses do in the study is they take this basic model of the different factors, and they've intertwined in it what they think are specific about gifted kids. So this is where it becomes more useful, I feel like. So, they're saying they use students with gifts and talents, so SWGT. So what are the things we have some control over? Training teachers. I know in Jeffco, they're training up all staff on QPR. Mixed messages, feeling misunderstood. The psychological autopsy revealed that Patrick was not supported in Jeffco, even though he was in a gifted center. He was only supported emotionally in the small private school from their perspective, because there weren't supports, basically. Again, there's more of this in the study itself. So these are just some of my high takeaways. Get them out of the basement or any other isolated place if you've got any concerns. Safe storage of guns. My son had a gun cabinet as soon as he had a gun, but he also had the key. Never even occurred to us that he would use that gun that way. And remember, those over-excitabilities don't go away with age. So when I filter this, like he was decided he was going to show her who was right. I mean, he was that stubborn, and he was that wrapped up that he decided that was his solution. Insane, crazy. And keep communication open. I would say as parents, we kind of let off the reins a little bit when he turned 18, because we wanted him to feel like he had agency, and that he, it was his life and his choices. And maybe he wasn't quite ready for that yet because of the asynchrony. I don't know. So this is another, these are some other things that came out of Tracy's talk. Keep an eye out. He says, above all, do something. So it is absolutely a myth that if you say something to somebody, you're going to trigger them to do it. It's not true at all. You ask them direct questions. There's another slide about that. The other one is once suicidal, always suicidal. Never give up. Patrick wasn't that person. The only person we know he talked about suicide with was her, and it felt like it was a manipulation, and his friend Evan, and that was more like early high school, existential depression, just kind of musing about options, more intellectual than anything else. And then there's another really nice link to this healthychildren.org. That's 10 things parents can do. So again, this spiral, think about all those factors. If you've got somebody you're concerned about, I would just take out a piece of paper and say, what are the risks? What are the protective factors? Like, try to get a picture of it. I haven't quite figured out how to template that, but maybe it's just filling in the spiral. I'm not sure. This is where it gets very interesting. So I've heard Tracy say this a couple of times. He says the data, he doesn't really have the data because they don't have a checkbox for was the person gifted when somebody completes suicide. But he said he totally believes that GT kids may have fewer attempts, but they tend to complete on fewer tries. So as far as we know with Patrick, he only ever tried once. He looked it up online to make sure that it worked. So that's why we really have to protect them, because you don't get a reset button, right? Okay, and then just quickly living without him. It's been a really rough go, but I feel like, I don't know, I feel like it's somehow I was the person who could bring this forward and kind of tell the story about a typical gifted kid who, things went terribly wrong in the hopes of shining a light on the corners where you might be able to dust out and have it not happen. And like I said, we're really blessed. He had an amazing friend group for an 18-year-old. And they've turned into quite phenomenal young boys, men. They're men now. So these are the direct questions. I think everybody has access to these. Are you feeling suicidal or that you'd hurt yourself? Do you have a plan? And then get professional help, or QPR. So that's question, persuade, refer, same concepts. Try to get a no harm contract. Remove means don't leave them alone. And on the positive note, this has kind of become part of my work is to, I created a foundation a few years ago. The year after Patrick passed, some of my JAGC friends, the Jeffco Association of Gifted Friends, gave me money, and I gave scholarships to his friends who were graduating that year. And then out of that, when I started to engage in Gifted and Talented again, a couple years after he passed, my work has been pretty much only in the Wheat Ridge High School Gifted and Talented program. And so every year we raise funds and give scholarships to graduating seniors at Wheat Ridge High School. That's last year's group. And they're just phenomenal. I love to watch them grow from freshmen to seniors. Not having been able to do that this year, haven't met the freshmen yet, but we did give scholarships on Zoom in May. That was fun. So I will stop it there and see if you have any questions, Colleen.
Yeah, first, Terry, thanks. I actually wrote down something that you said at the very beginning of your presentation, and you had said to take the academic and marry it with a lived experience. And just thank you for taking us into your lived experience, because this is a very important topic, I think, for everybody, both in this room and not in this room right now. So I thank you very much. If anybody does have any questions, then please, you can either unmute yourself and you can ask Terry yourself, or you can go ahead and type those into the chat. Val Davis, Terry did say, thank you for sharing this hard story. I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yeah, I will. So I'm going to make the plug for the crosses then while you guys contemplate it. It's usually crickets. It's a lot. I apologize, but I think it's important because I believe that people start to see him in the people who they love, because he was pretty typical. He was like archetypical. I feel like adorable, if I say so myself. So here's the plug for the crosses. Tracy Cross has been doing this work that is out of the School of Education at William and Mary College, and he's been conducting psychological autopsies for about 30 years. And Jennifer's involved in that work too, but I think Tracy kind of started with it. And every time I've heard him talk about this, he says, if you are interested in this work, please reach out. You can find him online or just reach out to me and I'll make the connection, because they're very concerned that when they retire, there's not going to be sort of a staple of people that have both the psychological background and the educational background to do this very important work. So that's my plug for the Crosses. The other thing I'll say is Jennifer Cross, and I haven't had a chance to really look into this too much, but one of the things that's happening at William and Mary is because they do this work, they've actually been brought in to assist the people who do the suicide prevention programming at William and Mary. And they're working with Syracuse University on a model that goes way deeper than sort of QPR, and actually has exercises where you're practicing answering those questions, kind of role playing, so that the RAs in the dorms and the people who are most likely to be in a position of intervening have more confidence. I went through the Jeffco QPR parent training, and it was great. It's really good and visual, helps you think about the factors. There's a wall of protection, and it's all like, it sticks. But having just done that, I wouldn't feel confident asking the question, especially a couple months later driving the car. I don't know. I think that it's one of those things where practice would make you more effective, but don't let that ever stop you from trying if you feel like you need to try.
So Terry, there's a lot of thank yous in the chat for sharing your story. And there was one question. Jana wrote, do you know the psychological autopsy details of the girl they studied? And do you know if there was any of the warning signs that were different from the boys'?
Yeah, so actually this is covered in the PA. So Tracy didn't do the one on the young girl. A doctoral student out of Tennessee or something, if you Google psychological autopsy, or send me an email and I'll send you the link. The girl was a prolific writer. This is the big difference. Like, we didn't have journals from Patrick, but the girl had written journals, had written about her suicidal ideation, had written poems. All four of the boys were big gamers. Imaginational, like serious gamers. And it's been a while since I read that section again, but in the front, so the front end of the PA is probably 5 pages of like really current suicide statistics, because it was just published in January, before they get into the specifics about Patrick. But there is a place where he says, this is the fourth one, and this is what I see that's common across them. And that imaginational and gameplay, and intensity around gameplay. I mean, like Patrick's best friend said, oh yeah, like he was a general. Like when they would play games, like he was so strategic. It took it incredibly seriously, would get lost in it, essentially.
So we did have just one more question come up, and we have about 30 seconds left.
Okay, so, I'll give a quick answer.
Your best suggestion really fast. Do you have any suggestions on the best way to educate our children on how to appropriately, I just lost it, on how to appropriately respond to suicidal thoughts in their friends? So
yeah, I would say look at the QPR as a basis. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is get everybody comfortable with asking those questions and making the referral. And so you don't want kids feeling like they're responsible for each other. I think everybody goes through this in middle school. I know we did in my house, and that was particularly dicey with my daughter after having lost my son. So, have them use those tools. We have Safe to Tell, use Safe to Tell. Don't let them take it on themselves. That's a really tough one, because I would,
as an administrator, definitely echo the Safe to Tell. We get many every single year, and when they do a Safe to Tell, it comes to me, the administrator of the school, It goes to the police department, and it's actually owned by the district attorney's office to ensure that essentially everything is acted on and everything is taken seriously. And we do take every single thing very seriously. And so it's a great outlet for those kids who don't know what to do. They can just put it in there and give us enough information, and we'll kind of take that out of their hands. But unfortunately, that is our time, Terry. Thank you so much. I think I just echo what everybody else has said. This is much needed. Your voice is much needed, and we thank you for sharing your story. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording right now.